Thunder split the sky, and the coven hall shook as black fire rose like a tide. The narrator said, Elara saw Cale step toward Lady Morwen, and terror cut the air. Elara said, Cale, don't. But the storm swallowed her voice. Heat pressed in, glass sang, and runes cracked. Cale said, Forgive me, eyes hollow as ash, and Morwen smiled like a blade. The floor heaved, candles burst, smoke tasted of iron. Elara reached for power and found emptiness, a cold hole where light once lived. Morwen said, Power flees the unworthy, and the hall's sigils fell dark. Wind hammered the doors. Elara's heart beat like a drum in a grave. She grabbed a fallen charm and stumbled as beams caved. The narrator said, Love pulled her forward, fear held her back. Stones screamed, night bent, and Cale turned away. Elara said, I will not lose you, while the roof cracked open, and a shadow hand reached for her throat. The ruins hissed as rain met ember, and silence took a sharp breath. The narrator said, Elara moved through smoke, throat raw, eyes burning. She tasted stone dust and old spells gone cold. Elara said, It is my fault, and the words felt heavier than the beam at her feet. Somewhere, a bell cracked in the wind, like a broken heart. She searched for a spark inside and felt only frost. The hall held memories, laughter, warm tea, patient hands guiding hers. Now the walls leaned like tired giants. The narrator said she feared the emptiness would stay forever. A charm glowed weakly, then died as if ashamed. She pressed fingers to the floor as thunder rolled close. Elara said, I will find him, but doubt slid between syllables, thin as a blade. The storm dimmed, and a low growl rose from the dark doorway behind her. Boots scuffed behind her, steady and sure, cutting through the ruins' hush. The narrator said, Gabriel reached Elara before the darkness did. He swept a fallen beam aside and said a word that hummed like a quiet drum. Gabriel said, Breathe, and his voice steadied the air. Elara said, I can't feel it, and fear caught on the edge of the words. Sparks cooled on wet stone. The ward light drew a soft circle. He wrapped his coat over her shoulders, rain thudding like small fists. The narrator said, He wanted to shield her from loss he knew too well. Gabriel said, We move now, eyes scanning the shadows. She nodded, but the cold in her chest did not lift. A shard rolled, ringing once, and the ward dimmed as something heavy stepped beyond its line. From the archway, a cane struck stone, slow and sure, like a metronome for storms. The narrator said, Alden stepped into the ward's edge and read the ruin as if it spoke. Alden said, The dark hunts your heart, child, and his gaze softened, then hardened. Elara said, I will not run, though her breath shook. The ward shivered under a gust that smelled of iron and wet earth. Gabriel said, Name it, and the old man traced sigils in air, lines bright then dull. The hall sighed, and a shadow peeled from a pillar and vanished. The narrator said, Alden carried regret like a cloak, but wisdom like a blade. Alden said, We leave, and you must choose whom you trust. Elara looked toward the path where Cale had gone. A distant horn sounded once, low, like a promise turning into a threat. They crossed the courtyard where rain had polished every stone to a mirror. The narrator said, Elara stopped at the broken gate and faced the road Cale had taken. Her hands were steady now, though the cold inside still gnawed. Gabriel said, We have hours before the trail fades, voice calm, eyes fierce. Alden said, Power returns through bonds or blood, and let the words hang like smoke. Elara said, Then we find the bond, and her throat no longer shook. Wind tugged at her hair, and a raven wheeled high, a black note against a pale sky. The narrator said, Her goal sharpened. Recover her magic, save the man, stop the witch. Gabriel nodded once, a vow without a ring. Alden lifted his cane, listening to distant thunder. The gate creaked open by itself, as if welcoming them into a trap. Wind tore through the pines like a warning siren, and the path funneled into shadow. The narrator said, Elara ran first, breath burning, boots slipping on wet needles. A branch snapped ahead. A low growl answered behind. Gabriel said, left ridge now, and his hand brushed steel. The sky stayed iron, and rain hissed on stone like the forest was whispering. No, Elara said, it is tracking my emptiness, and shame flared hot, then cold. A shape broke from fog, all teeth and smoke, and the ward on Gabriel's wrist flared. He said, trust me, while his eyes searched for lies in the trees. Elara said, I do not trust the road, and fear moved with her like a second spine. They slid behind a fallen trunk as claws scraped bark. The narrator said, the beast circled once and paused, as if listening, then turned toward a set of prints that were not their own. Silence fell inside the mill ruins, save for the soft drum of rain on the broken wheel. The narrator said, Elara's hands shook as the ward faded to a calm ember. Gabriel said, you did not freeze, and the words were simple, steady, kind. She said, I wanted to run, and the truth sat between them like a wet cloak. He wrung water from his sleeve, breath slow, shoulders tight as if bracing for a blow. The room smelled of old flour and damp oak. Dust rose in tiny sparks where their steps landed. The narrator said, exhaustion softened anger into something like trust. Elara traced a carved raven on a beam and felt a small pulse under the wood. Gabriel said, a mark, and his jaw set in thought. She said, Morwen leaves threads, and fear trembled into focus. Outside, the wheel turned once, creaked, and stopped as if waiting for a hand to push it again. Fog thickened on the road beyond the mill, and tracks forked like choices no one wanted. The narrator said, a whistle cut the mist, bright and reckless. Tamsin slid from the brush, grin sharp, eyes bright. Tamsin said, you make noise like lost geese, but her gaze tagged danger fast. Gabriel said, name your stake, and his hand stayed close to steel. Tamsin said, debt to Alden. Plus I hate bullies, and tossed a coin etched with a raven. The coin spun, caught pale light, and froze in air. Shadows braided into a mirror, and Morwen's face rose, calm as winter water. Lady Morwen said, run, little moths, I own the wind. The narrator said, control wrapped the air. Branches held their breath. Elara said, you will not touch him, though her power stayed silent. The mirror rippled, smiled, and blew out like a candle, leaving cold that felt like a promise. They found Alden at a shrine of stones, where moss held the rain like small cups. The narrator said, the world grew quiet there, and the wind lowered its voice. Alden said, your line is older than the coven, and laid his cane across the cairn. Elara said, you knew, and grief pressed hard on the word. He said, I feared truth would break you before fate could shape you, eyes rimmed with long nights. Gabriel studied the tree line, but his jaw eased at the calm. The shrine smelled of sage and wet granite. A bell vine chimed soft as breath. Alden said, your power binds through choice, not blood alone. Tamsin said, choice is messy, and kicked a pebble at doubt. The narrator said, wisdom felt like weight and like light. Alden said, to save one love may do many. And the rain paused, as if to hear Elara answer. The road bent toward black hills, and clouds stacked like walls. The narrator said Elara walked faster, fear pacing with resolve. Gabriel said, Morwen moves us like pieces, and the words tasted bitter. Tamsin said, then jumped the board, and flipped the raven coin into her palm. Alden said, the catacombs under the chapel hold a conduit, and the map unfurled in his voice. Elara pictured Kale's face, and felt the cold inside tilt toward heat. The mud sucked at their boots. A crow tracked them from a dead pine. The narrator said, her choice burned. Save one and risk many, or sever love to save strangers. Gabriel touched her shoulder, brief and brave. Elara said, we go to the chapel and end her chain. And the wind seemed to nod. A horn sounded far off, and the crow leapt, carving a path that led straight into the dark. Morning light sifted through fog and made the marsh look gentle, almost kind. The narrator said, for a breath, danger felt far, like thunder on another shore. A lone ferryman hailed them from a reed boat and smiled with easy calm. Lysander said, roads are watched, water sleeps, and offered passage for a favor later. Gabriel said, name it now, but the man only tapped his brow and bowed. Elara felt the hush as a weight, not a gift, and her pulse tagged a rhythm of doubt. The oars barely kissed the black water. Ripples folded themselves like secrets. The ferryman glanced at her too long, then looked away too fast. Tamsin said, friendly ghosts cost the most, voice light, eyes hard. A heron lifted slow, legs trailing like lines of ink. The narrator said, safety wore a new face and fit too well. The reed sighed, and something under the boat breathed back. The boat nosed into a willow cove where light pooled like quiet wine. The narrator said, they ate dry bread and listened to the drip of leaves. Gabriel said, you held the fear steady, and the praise landed warm. Elara said, it is steadier with you near, and the words surprised her. Lysander traced a map in silt and drew a safe path between dead towns. Tamsin said too safe, but she softened when Elara laughed once, small and true. A dragonfly hovered, glass wings ticking like a tiny clock. Gabriel said, if we cut west we dodge her riders, then paused as if hearing another plan inside his head. Lysander said, trust the water, not the road, and wipe the map clean too soon. The narrator said, closeness braided with need and something tender. Elara touched Gabriel's knuckles, quick as a secret. He smiled, and the ferryman smiled wider than before. Ruins rose from the marsh like ribs, and an old chapel bell lay cracked in reeds. The narrator said, inside, candles guttered without flame, fed by breath alone. Kale stepped from the aisle's shadow, thinner, eyes ringed with night. Kale said, she saved me, then bound me. Chains can feel like mercy. Elara said, you chose the chain, and the echo did not return. He pointed at the altar where a mirror of dark water held 100 futures. Kale said, you burn for one life and call it love. She guards the many. Gabriel's jaw set, but his hand eased off steel. The chapel smelled of rust and wet chalk. Light fell in bars like cells. Kale said, you and I are the same fire, only aimed different. The narrator said, both truths stood and neither bowed. Doubt licked at Elara's heel as the mirror rippled in a silent laugh. Wind slammed the nave doors, and the mirror surged up like a living rope. The narrator said, the ferryman threw off his hood, eyes green as cut glass. Lady Morwen stepped through the water as if it were silk. Morwen said, you brought me what I asked for, and her smile was a quiet knife. Gabriel moved to shield Elara, but Lysander touched his wrist and stilled him. Tamsin said, don't. But the word broke as chains of light snapped from the pool. Elara said, Lysander, and the name tasted of rust. He said, balance, eyes sorry and bright. The chain bit her wrists cold. The chapel rang like struck iron. Kale flinched, then bowed his head as if praying to a storm. The narrator said, "Trust tore along old seams and bled fast." Morwen said, "Kneel," and the floor decided for Elara. Silence followed the shock, thick as wet wool, and the chains hummed like bees. The narrator said, "Elara tasted salt and iron and a truth she had dodged." Morwen had never hunted power. She had her conduit sitting beside her all along. Elara said, "You wanted him near me," and the words were almost a whisper. Gabriel said, "I am the key," and grief slipped under the calm. Kale stared at the floor where water pooled into a black crown. Tamsin said, "We cut the lock or we drown," voice low, eyes bright with fear. Lysander looked away, shame folding his shoulders. The narrator said betrayal redrew the map and the heart at once. Elara breathed, steady, choosing pain over panic. She said, "We go to the catacombs and break your altar." Gaze fixed on the dark door below the choir. The chains eased as if daring her to try. The chapel exhaled after the storm, and the broken bell held a cupped silence. The narrator said, Elara stood where chains had hummed, and the air felt thin as old paper. Water ticked from the rafters. Slow, patient, counting what was lost. Gabriel said, "We are still here," and the steadiness frayed at the edges. She traced wet stone, finding grooves worn by prayers and fear. The mirror pool lay dark, but a faint ripple moved as if a thought passed under it. Tamsin said, "Say the hurt out loud," and she looked away first. Elara said, "He was placed beside me to light what I could not, and shame cooled to calm." The narrator said, "Clues align like stars only seen after a blackout." Below the choir, a draft rose that smelled of iron and sage, and with it the hint of a door that had never wanted to be found. The narrator said, "Memory rose on the smell of sage and wet iron, and present time thinned." A cramped room, a storm outside, a small lantern painting rings on a table. Alden's hands hovered over a sleeping girl as thunder shook the shutters. Alden said, "A conduit keeps her alive when the tide turns," and the words stained the air. In the chapel now, his voice seemed to echo from a wall that was not there. Elara saw the market years later, rain silvering the awnings, Gabriel offering shelter, with a calm she mistook for luck. Gabriel said, "I felt pulled," and the pull became a chain she could finally see. The lantern hissed in memory, and the chapel's puddles hissed in reply. The narrator said, "What began as mercy became design." Elara said, "You chose for me," and somewhere a shutter in the past closed for good. Footsteps tapped the nave like a slow heartbeat, and Alden stepped into the soft gray. The narrator said, breath shortened, and space narrowed to 3 faces and a truth. Alden said, "I bound the conduit so you would live," and silence pressed back. Elara's pulse drummed in her ears, steady, then sharp, then steady again. Gabriel said, "Did I choose or was I placed?" And the pause after it hurt. Dust hung like pale bees, caught in a bar of winter light from the clerestory. Alden said, "I chose once so you might choose later," and his eyes would not hold theirs. The narrator said, "Love and control stood arm to arm, both certain, both flawed." Elara said, "No more choices for me without me," and the words set like stone. The dark door below the choir groaned, as if the story itself agreed to open its throat. From the mirror, a voice like winter glass laid itself over stone. The narrator said, "Lady Morwen did not stride. She settled, certain as a verdict." Lady Morwen said, "I harvest bonds because love is the only power that pays its debts." The words were calm, clean, and terrible. Elara said, "You call it mercy when you cage it," and the air cooled further. Morwen said, "Order is a kindness. I cut small to spare the body," and her gaze held no doubt. Tamsin cursed under her breath, yet her eyes flicked to the door, counting exits. The narrator said, Good and evil traded masks, and both faces fit. Gabriel said, "You will not spend this bond," and the mirror bruised with light. And Morwen smiled as if blessing a child for refusing a crown. The stillness that followed felt like a hand closing on every future at once. The narrator said, "Truth settled like dawn fog, soft and everywhere, and nothing looked the same." Elara breathed once for hurt and once for clarity. The chapel's cold eased a little, and the ribs of the roof felt less like a cage. Gabriel said, "So this was the truth all along," and a weight slid from his voice. Alden bowed his head, a small surrender that did not ask for pardon. Tamsin said, "We write the next piece," and set the raven coin on the step. The coin did not spin. It waited. Elara said, "We descend, we break the altar, and we choose together," and heat touched the words. The narrator said, "Law stayed, but it made room for will." From the dark door, a breath of warmer air rose, thin as a promise, and the first step down rang like a bell that called the living. The catacomb air held its breath, and the steps counted down like a drum under skin. The narrator said, "Torchlight jittered on wet stone, and every drop echoed like a foot behind them." Elara said, "She is here," and the flame bent as if agreeing. Gabriel said, "On my left," voice tight, breath measured like a blade. Far below, a low thrum rose, the sound of a heart that was not kind. Tamsin said, "Doors ahead," and the word clipped the dark. A narrow arch showed flickers of cold light, pulsing to a rhythm that matched Elara's fear. Chains whispered on the floor as if learning words. Alden said, "Hold to the vow, not the wound." The corridor narrowed, and the torch coughed. The narrator said, "Silence swelled, then thinned to a wire." Elara said, "Now," and they stepped through as the light on the other side curled its fingers to strike. The chamber opened like a throat, and the conduit altar beat with pale light. The narrator said, Lady Morwen stood calm, hands folded, the storm caged behind her eyes. Lady Morwen said, "Offer love, spare the many," and her tone was prayer and verdict. Elara said, "Love is not a tithe," and the torch popped like a shouted no. Gabriel said, "You weigh lives like coins," and his jaw worked once, then set. Morwen said, "Order saves children. You will never meet." And the altar brightened as if to bless her claim. Alden stepped forward, cane steady, and said, "Balance is not a chain." Tamsin said, "Then cut it," and flicked a knife toward a binding line. Light hissed and recoiled, throwing sparks that smelled of rain on iron. The narrator said, "Truth and will struck like flint." The altar's pulse quickened, and the floor shook as if breath became fists. The altar screamed without sound, and chains lashed for hearts. The narrator said a line of light snapped toward Elara, and Alden stepped into it as if into rain. Alden said, "I owe you a dawn," and the chain burned his robes to ash. Gabriel caught him, knees hitting stone that rang like a bell. Elara said, "No," and the word cracked small and sharp. Tamsin pressed cloth to a wound the light had made from nothing. Alden's breath came thin, then even thinner, and his eyes found Elara. Alden said, "Choose together," and a tired smile lifted once. The torch guttered, and the altar dimmed as if it listened. The narrator said, silence swelled with grief that did not break. It shaped. Gabriel bowed his head, and the floor kept the secret of tears. The cost settled like dust, and every mote felt like a name. Elara rose, and the room tilted toward her like iron to a magnet. The narrator said, Gabriel took her hand, and the ward's light climbed her skin like dawn. Lady Morwen said, "Prove your mercy," and lifted a palm that held night. Elara said, "I choose love and law together," and the altar's veins flared. Gabriel said, "With me," and the bond lit, bright and clean. Fire met rain as steam curled off stone, and light carved shadow into sharp edges. More wind swept chains wide. Elara cut them with a scream that felt like birth. The narrator said, silence followed each strike, then returned louder like waves. Kale stepped from the rear and slammed his blade through a binding, jaw set against pain. Morwen said, ungrateful, and hurled a spear of white. Elara crossed hands with Gabriel, turned the spear, and sent it back into the altar's heart. The altar's light folded in on itself and went dark, like a star deciding to rest. The narrator said, steam thinned, showing cracked stone and hands that would not let go. Elara stood, shaking, and the bond lay quiet, but alive between their palms. Gabriel said, we did not trade a life, and wonder softened the ache. Tamsin wiped her face with a dirty sleeve and said, he made it count. Kale leaned on the wall, eyes hollow and open. The chamber listened, and the drip returned, small and steady. Elara said, we carry him up, and her voice was a vow and a prayer. The narrator said, silence held the shape of a bell that would ring later. Above them, the keep groaned as if an old throat cleared. The final ember on the altar blinked once and died, and a faint horn rose from far beyond the stone, calling them toward what breaks next. Smoke thinned and drifted toward the cracked ceiling, and the drip slowed. The narrator said, stone cooled under their knees, and the torches sighed with small breath. Damp air tasted like iron turned to rain. Elara stood still and listened to the quiet. No chains moved, no altar spoke. Gabriel said easy, but his voice barely rose above the hush. The fallen robes by her boots seemed lighter than air and heavier than grief. Puddles held the last light like tired eyes. Tamsin pressed her palm to the floor and closed her own. The narrator said, silence shaped the truth that nothing will be the same. A faint echo answered from the stair, gentle as a lullaby. Elara counted the faces and found one less. She set her hand on the cold step and knew what the night had taken. The narrator said, time moved like dew on stone, slow and sure. Elara sat on the stair and watched dust float through an amber thread of light. She saw the shrine, the bellflowers, the cane tapping a rhythm of care. She heard a soft laugh from a day when tea steamed and fear was small. Gabriel leaned against the wall and let a breath carry a weight away. He said he knew the price, and the words fell like leaves. Tamsin traced the raven coin and did not flip it. Memory pressed close, but it did not crush. The narrator said guilt offered its old chair. They did not sit. A far drip counted a new hour. Elara looked at her hands and felt warmth instead of frost. The world would go on, she thought, but it would walk with a slower step. They reached the ruin's edge at gray dawn, and mist cupped the ground like water. The narrator said, Kale waited in the broken arch, thinner and honest in his stillness. Gabriel's step slowed, and the wind eased as if listening. Kale said, I held a door so you could pass, and the line trembled at the end. Elara's heart leaned toward pain and did not fall. She said, you hurt me, and the truth made space for breath. A bird called once, then twice, and the day answered with pale light. Kale said, I am sorry, and the words did not ask for a chain. The narrator said, time stretched and softened the sharp edge. Gabriel's hand brushed hers, not to lead, only to stay. Elara nodded once and let the past loosen its grip. Forgiveness did not sing, but it stood in the room. On the hill beyond the chapel, wind combed long grass, and clouds opened a pale road of light. The narrator said, Elara set the cane on a stone and listened for a lesson that might return. The memory of a voice arrived with the smell of sage. Alden said, choose together, and the line rang like a bell inside the chest. Tamsin wiped her eyes with her sleeve and laughed once at herself. Gabriel closed his hand around the air as if shaking an old friend's palm. The narrator said, "Past care does not vanish. It changes rooms." Elara thought of doors, of bonds, of a life not owned by fear. The cane leaned like a marker and like a guide. She smiled, small and real. A shadow moved off the grass, and the day felt a little larger. The narrator said, "By evening, the road lay open and wet, and the wind smelled like new rain." Elara walked to the broken gate where her fear once began. She set a shard of the altar on the post and let the ruin keep. Gabriel stepped close and did not speak. She said, "We choose together," and the words felt like home. The sky brightened at the rim, though the sun had slipped. Tamsin swung the gate wide and whistled a low tune that did not rush. The day did not promise ease, only the chance to try again. The narrator said, "Peace arrived in small pieces and stayed." Elara lifted her face to the damp air and felt her magic stir like a quiet tide. The road waited, and the night held its breath for what came next. Dawn rested on the ruins and did not hurry. The narrator said, "Mist softened edges and birds tested the quiet with shy notes. Stone cooled, water ticked, breath found a slower shape." Elara stood where the gate had once held her fear. Gabriel waited nearby and let the silence speak. Tamsin laid a hand on the old hinge and felt no pull. The road shimmered like a healed scar. The narrator said, "Loss stayed, but it loosened its claws." Elara said, "He is gone," and the truth did not break her. Wind lifted her hair and set it down again. A bell far off chimed once, then faded. The world inhaled. The question exhaled inside her chest and stayed. Was it worth the price? The narrator said, "They walked the road not as hunted, but as changed." Boots pressed water from ruts that refilled, then calmed. Elara placed the raven coin on a milestone and did not look back. Tamsin said, "For luck," and the smile was small and earned. Gabriel carried the cracked ward, now dark as ash. Fields opened. Smoke from far chimneys curled like quiet threads. A cart creaked somewhere beyond sight. The path thinned with each step, but it walked at their shoulder without spite. The narrator said, "Release did not shout, it breathed." At the fork, Elara lifted her hand. She said, "Forward," and the word felt clean. The road accepted the choice and folded their shadows into one long line that flowed toward light. They stopped at the hill where grass kept the shape of old knees. The narrator said, "Wind turned pages in the sky, and memory read aloud." Alden's voice arrived like warm tea on a cold port. Alden said, "Choose together, and let mercy keep its share." Elara closed her eyes and saw a lantern paint rings on a wooden table. Gabriel bowed his head as if to catch each word before it left. Tamsin traced the cane's carving with a thumb and sighed. The narrator said, "The echo did not fade. It nested." Elara said, "We will not spend love like coin," and the vow felt steady. The wind agreed in a low hum. The theme of their days stood in the open and asked nothing more than to be carried. The narrator said, "Days unfolded like careful paper, and the world found a new rhythm. Children chased a hoop past the market arch where fear once stood guard. A baker laughed, and flour rose like soft weather. Elara traded a charm for bread and kept her hands steady. Gabriel fixed a hinge and left it stronger than he found it. Tamsin taught a child the whistle that calls birds at dusk. Time walked, not ran. The old keep muttered less each night." The narrator said, "Change did not announce itself. It sat down and stayed." Elara said, "Thank you to no one and to all." On the ridge, clouds opened a window of light, and the day slipped through it with ease. Evening gathered without hurry, and the sky learned a tender blue. The narrator said, Elara stood where the road meets the field, and the wind braided hair and breath. Gabriel stepped beside her, close but not crowded. He said, "With you," and it was enough. She touched her palm to his, and the bond warmed like a small hearth. Far crows wrote slow letters across the light. The day bowed, the night answered. The narrator said, "Some losses remain, and some become lanterns." Elara lifted her chin, steady and bright. She whispered, "Truth must never be owned," and the words went out like a calm tide that would always return.